Welcome back! The Elephant Gambit begins with the most popular opening moves: pawn to e4, e5, knight to f3. Now, surprisingly the best move for black to high winning chances, it's not the usual knight c6. It's an aggressive counterplay with d5. In most cases, your opponent will capture the pawn on d5. Occasionally, they might try a different response. We'll cover both options. If then they take the pawn on d5, you don't immediately recapture. Instead, you continue your attack with e4, keeping the pressure on. At this stage, your opponent's knight is at a crossroads, and neither of its options looks appealing. The knight can't move to certain squares because your queen controls them. If the knight ventures to the center of the board on d4, you can capture the pawn on d5 and chase the knight away, keeping the initiative in your favor. Sooner or later, some of your opponents will try queen to e2, aiming to pin your pawn and attack it, hoping to resolve the pressure that way. At this point, you have several options, but the most aggressive is bishop to e7, where you sacrifice the pawn. Letting them capture it sets a clever trap, pushing them into a classic opening blunder. Play knight f6, they move their queen around recklessly, handing you valuable tempos for development. Once your king is in check, you simply block. After the inevitable trade, you bring another piece into play with tempo, further strengthening your position. At this point, your opponent may realize they need to develop their pieces too. A common response is bishop to b5, trying to apply pressure along the diagonal. However, you remain unfazed, fully committed to your gambit strategy. You can allow them to capture yet another pawn. Since you're playing the Elephant Gambit, they might become greedy and continue capturing your pieces one at a time. For example, they may target your rook next, but what they don't realize is that the position is already collapsing for them. It's nearly impossible to defend at this stage. Your next move, rook to b8, intensifies the pressure, putting you in a commanding position. Now let's explore some fascinating variations. For example, consider knight to c3, a move that appears in countless openings and is typically a solid choice. However, in this position, it's a losing blunder. Hard to believe, but true. After knight to c3, you respond with the surprising move rook to b4. At first glance, it seems unusual, but its purpose will soon become clear. No matter what move white plays next, you follow up with bishop to b7, and suddenly white's queen is trapped with no safe squares to retreat to. The brilliance of keeping your rook on b4 is that it blocks several escape routes for the queen. Your bishop now controls additional key squares, while your knight and other bishop restrict further movement. Adding to white's misery, their own knight on c3 takes away a critical escape square for the queen, making knight to c3 a devastating mistake. If white plays a more accurate move, such as castling, you still have powerful attacking ideas. For instance, you can play bishop to b7 immediately, targeting both the queen and the knight. Alternatively, rook to b6 is an even stronger option, and white will struggle to find a safe square for their queen. Let's say white retreats the queen to a safer square, taking advantage of the fact that the knight no longer blocks it. In response, you can bring your knight into the attack, targeting the queen once again. Depending on where the queen moves next, you can follow up with moves like bishop to a6, attacking the long diagonal, or bishop to f6, controlling another critical diagonal. Your rook restricts the queen's movement along the b-file, and your knight covers several key squares, making it incredibly difficult for white to find a safe spot for their queen. If white tries something like queen to a5, you can immediately redirect your attack to the king side with knight to f4. Notice how your knight on f4 creates threats, while your bishop, rook, and other pieces are ready to join the attack. The pressure builds quickly into a devastating offensive. Now, let's consider a typical mistake by white, such as knight to c3. A move that once again loses the game outright. Here you can sacrifice your knight to break open the king's position, and then swing your rook to the king side with a check. After the king moves, you can capture white's queen and easily secure the win. If you want to completely humiliate your opponent, instead of capturing the queen, you can play bishop to b7, threatening an unstoppable mate along the diagonal. For example, if white captures your queen, you deliver bishop takes f3 checkmate, showcasing the dominance of your position. If you prefer a safer approach, there's another clever trap you can set. When your opponent plays queen to e2, pinning your pawn to your king and attacking it, you can simply defend by developing your knight, a more standard move. If they try to exploit the pin, they'll likely play pawn to d3, attacking your pinned pawn once more. Since you can't move the e4 pawn, you respond by capturing their pawn on d5, which simultaneously protects your pawn on e4. At this point, they may still feel confident and play knight to c3, targeting your e4 pawn and queen with a double attack. However, you counter with bishop to b4, pinning their knight to the king. Now the position becomes an intriguing battle of pins and counterpins. If they try to break free with bishop to d2, intending to unpin their knight, you can calmly capture the knight on c3. After the trade, their position remains awkward because their pieces are still pinned. You can then castle, completing your development and consolidating your advantage. At this point, your opponent might start calculating potential responses, but the balance of the position is already tipping heavily in your favor. Here's what your opponent might think. I'll capture the pawn, and after you recapture, I'll take the pawn on e4, ending up a pawn ahead, while also disrupting your kingside pawn structure. They feel confident, but you turn the tables with a clever response. Instead of recapturing the bishop, you take the knight first. This is a decisive counterstrike because it attacks both their queen and their bishop simultaneously. They're now forced into losing a piece on the next move. For example, after the trades and pawn takes, you emerge with an extra knight in the endgame. If they check your king, you simply sidestep the threat. With no real attack left for them, your extra knight ensures a winning position. Alternatively, let's explore an even trickier approach. After d5, when they capture your pawn, you have two options. If you want to stay aggressive, you can push your pawn forward immediately to challenge their knight, which is a solid continuation for black. But if you want to set a trap, you'll play bishop to d6, positioning your bishop for an ambush. White will often develop their knight to c3, guarding their central pawn by knight f6. They'll then follow with bishop to c4, developing their bishop while providing additional protection to the d5 pawn. At this point, you strike with pawn to a4, forcing their knight to move. White typically doesn't want to retreat their knight or block their own development, so they may continue with castling, unaware that they're walking into your trap. If they choose between knight to d4 or another move, they'll struggle in either case. Let's say they bring their knight to the center. You can simply castle, and in most games, your opponent will follow suit and castle as well. It feels like the natural move. However, the Elephant Gambit is full of surprises, where standard moves often turn into losing blunders. Here, you can play bishop takes h2, known as the Greek gift sacrifice, luring the king out. You follow up with knight to g4, initiating the classic Greek gift attack that leads to a decisive win. If the king retreats, you play queen to h4, threatening checkmate. At this point, the only way for your opponent to avoid immediate loss is to provide an escape square for their king by moving the rook. Instead of delivering checkmate immediately, you first capture the f2 pawn, which is now undefended. After queen takes f2, you deliver a few precise checks, leading to a forced checkmate. Some opponents may take an aggressive approach, advancing to counterattack your pawn. However, you simply castle and ignore the threat. This knight can't remain inactive for long. If they continue, they expose themselves along the e-file, allowing you to play rook to e8, attacking and pinning the knight to the king, leading to a winning position. If they try to defend, you can attack again and capture it on the next move. If your opponent chooses to castle instead of preventing the attack, they fall into a devastating Greek gift sacrifice. You can still play bishop takes h2, followed by knight to g4 check, forcing the king to move while your queen sneaks in for the attack. With the knight controlling key squares, your queen finds the perfect angle to strike, ultimately winning the knight. In most cases, your opponent will capture the e4 pawn, believing it's a strong move that also pressures your queen. However, this only helps you reposition it. Now you play queen to h4, then setting up queen to h2, leading to a crushing attack.